We're living in a period of historical significance, matters that will still be relevant in 100 years' time. The widespread murder of 35,000 protesters for the best part of 50 years. Thugs have been bashing women. I must admit, I was sceptical 20 plus years ago. Prime Minister Netanyahu back then, we've made some grievous mistakes. President Trump has presented these psychopaths in the soon-to-be former regime in Iran with an option. We need to open the aperture in terms of news doing the heavy lifting for the whole of the world. Things can only go one of three ways.
Good evening.
Great
Citizens.
Down and out.
Never surrender.
He's done it.
Famous victory. We're going to come back.
Turn to glory.
Welcome, Michael. With your expertise on the Middle East and conflict from your many years of experience, I thought it would be beautiful to sit down and have a bit of a discussion on everything that's going on at present, everything that's moving so quickly, and a little bit of why your expertise is so unique.
A little bit about me. In my first career, 30 plus year veteran of the Australian Army, served in East Timor, Bougainville, Iraq, a couple of tours of Afghanistan, and then I performed a senior leadership role with the United Nations Truth Supervision Organisation, operating in Jerusalem with 153 unarmed military observers drawn from 27 different countries operating in Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Egypt. And more recently, after the October 2023 violence in Israel and the rabid and rampant anti-Semitism we've seen across the comfortable and complacent West, I've stepped away from my first career in the profession of arms and founded a charity to combat anti-Semitism. Not Jewish, not motivated by religious conviction, just lived experience in Israel that those that threaten Israelis and the Jewish diaspora worldwide pose an unacceptable safety risk to my family and my unborn descendants. But we're living in momentous times. We've seen the second strike by the United States under the Trump administration and the state of Israel into Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism and a horrible regime that has brutally suppressed Iran, Persia, for the best part of 50 years. And so it seems as though there's a reasonable prospect that the existential threat, not only to the Jewish state, but the West, posed by a nuclear armed Iran, will permanently be past tense.
With your experience in the Middle East, how much is that idea that they are the head of the tentacle of all the proxies? How much was that seen by you in your operations over there?
I must admit, I was skeptical 20 plus years ago, in the early noughts where Prime Minister Netanyahu back then was very clear-eyed about Iran being the head of the snake. But of course, the way Israeli politics work is that there's a lot of competition of ideas and perspectives. And I actually found some of the opposing forces, ex-Mossad people, ex-IDF, quite compelling that perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu was acting for partisan reasons with some of his messaging. I'm not a member of any political party, certainly not Likud, but I think that history has proven Prime Minister Netanyahu to be spot on. He was clear-eyed and far-sighted as to the threat of a nuclear armed Iran, but stepping out of the argy-bargy of Israeli politics and messaging, I think that Douglas Murray was clear-eyed when he said that if someone is saying that they're going to murder you, you ought to believe them. And so I think with Iranian support, not only of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and other terrorist states, and the widespread murder of what 35,000 protesters just in the last 2 months gives the whole of the world a very clear perspective on what the horrible autocratic regime, the Ayatollahs and the IRGC constituted, not only to a tolerant people, the Persian people, but to its neighbours.
What effect does this have trickled down that you can observe and comment on?
Yeah, so look, we're living in a period of historical significance where matters that will still be relevant in 100 years' time are playing out. In my judgment, the uh, applying the Ayatollahs and the brutal theocratic dictatorship of Iran to past tense is not only a net positive to the region, but the whole world. The North Arabian Gulf is still the source of a very large percentage of the petrochemicals required for the West. Whether we like it or not, our amazing civilization is still underpinned by cheap energy, a lot of which comes out of the North Arabian Gulf. And so, if we look at what we've seen occur just in the last few months, or the last year and some change of the current U.S. administration, where not only the hostages are back, but the Iranians lost their nuclear capability. It looks like they will lose their hooks into the nation, where Venezuela has been defenestrated as well, another horrible dictator that's sitting atop vast petrochemical supplies. It will take a little bit of time for that to iron out, but what we're seeing at the moment, geostrategically, are significant developments, and it's an honour to be a commentator watching these momentous events unfold.
You mentioned the petroleum or gas that's in that region, and there is definitely a risk of destabilization by having a preemptive attack like has occurred. Can you comment on why Iran is such a threat to the West that that risk is worth taking, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so Iranian regime has been quite honest and objective since 1979. Death to the little Satan, that is Israel. Death to the big Satan, the United States. As an Australian patriot, that also applies to our Western liberal democracy down in the south of the globe, between the Indian and Pacific Ocean, because Australia has benefited markedly from the US rules-based global order, which has been established since the Second World War. And so I think that there's evidence that Iran was rapidly working to re-establish its missile capability. It seems that the Ayatollahs, the genocidal maniacs that are bent on the destruction of the Jewish state, were going to reconstitute their nuclear capability if given the opportunity. And so, as a father and as a humanist, I would prefer not to see a loss of life. But I'm not going to walk into a horrible tomorrow that may constitute a safety risk to my unborn descendants, as it relates specifically to what I believe we'll see in Iran in the next weeks or potentially months. I believe that there will continue to be targeting for between 1 and 4 weeks. what has happened prior to, or what happens prior to kinetic activity, is that a series of objectives and targets are identified. They're racked and stacked based on probability and consequence. And in the event that objectives, it might be individuals. Khomeini is resting in pieces, as I understand. He was someone that needed to be engaged, but of course. He knew that as well, and so he was a difficult target. I'm sure that there are other regime officials that haven't yet been targeted, but would be in the joint prioritized effects list for elimination. But what I believe we will see in coming weeks is President Trump has presented these psychopaths in the soon-to-be former regime in Iran with an option: surrender or be eliminated. I think some people will choose surrender, others will choose to be eliminated. But as the material capability of the IRGC and all of their thugs that they brought in from different parts of the Middle East to murder civilians, I think that an additional capability will step back up. I expect that there will be some reprisals because the context of Iran is, for the best part of 50 years, thugs have been bashing women for the crime of not covering their faces, pouring acid on their faces, gouging out their eyes. Rape has been used as a means of torture and control. And indeed, just in the last couple of the months, credible reports have it that upwards of 30,000 protesters were murdered over a weekend. This is an odious regime. And for those that are listening to this podcast, I would ask people to make sure you get your information from a wide variety of sources. It's my contention that we live in an Orwellian age of gaslighting and purport and projection. If you're not hearing the level of the depravity and violence that the Ayatollahs and the IRGC have meted out to Iranians in the last couple of months, take it from me that we need to open the aperture in terms of news reporting.
With your experience on observing and being involved in conflict like this, when it comes to regime change, there's often a vacuum that can get consumed and can turn into greater danger. And there's no doubt that the Ayatollah who has led Iran for since the late 1980s, being eliminated, is regime change. So, from your perspective, how do we in the West, or do our Western powers ensure that regime change is done in a manner which does not create further risk, both in Iran and I'm sure with the proxies, there are many power vacuums that are occurring based off people who had a relationship with the Ayatollah. That relationship is no longer as valued.
Yeah, so I think that a couple of tips right for now, and this aligns pretty closely with what I'm seeing from the current US administration. It doesn't involve Western boots on the ground because it's not needed. I was a veteran of Iraq and two tours of Afghanistan. I think we've learned by the mistakes of Gulf War II, and that's not something that the current commander-in-chief of the US military will countenance, and that's for valid reasons. The other point I would put is that it doesn't play out in the court of public opinion. The last thing the US administration would want to do is to, for example, telegraph their intentions in granular detail to news outlets such as the CNN or the British Broadcasting Corporation or even the Australian Broadcasting
From
Corporations.
a military perspective, how do the United States, how do does Israel ensure that the power vacuums are filled correctly as opposed to more dangerously?
Yeah, so let's keep it really simple. Carrots and sticks. These are the policies that we're expecting of the interim and then subsequent um, governing apparatus in Iran. Now, the building blocks in Iran are actually far better than the building blocks in Iraq because Iran is a plural and a tolerant country with thousands of years of civilizational history. I'm glasses half full as to the prognosis of Iran. There will be a worsening in the short term. It's probable, more so than possible, that there will be additional munitions fired from Iran at targets like we've seen in the UAE and Kuwait, etc. And so that may occur for some time yet. There may be some diehards, and I'm sure that there would be, some liaison and collaboration to, establish an insurgency. I think the people that have benefited from the regime in the past will try to hold on to power, and so I'm expecting that there will need to be some support of opposition forces into an interim and then new government. That will take some time. I think it'll be months as opposed to days and weeks. Surely there will be some reprisals as well, where people that have been brutal to their neighbours under the regime, they will meet a grisly end. Think in Libya with Gaddafi. Again, that's not an indicator of what failure will look like. There will need to be you know, instability for a period in time, but stepping it back to nation state level, a carrots and sticks approach where certain policy positions will allow some of the petrochemicals and industry to be sold that will stimulate the economy. But of course, if the powers that be, that is the US and Israel, that are providing leadership in this regard, are seeing indicators and warnings that suggest that the message isn't getting through. I'm expecting a continuance of targeting. And that's similar to what we've seen up in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Hezbollah, the Radwan forces, still pose challenges to leadership and governance in Lebanon, and that's why there's been ongoing targeting from the IDF. Every time a couple of Hezbollah forces come together and say a salam and have a cup of chai, there seems to be a JDAM or a small drone that busts up the party. That I think will occur not only in Lebanon for some time, but also Iran. But yeah, I'm very optimistic as to what the actions in 25, 26, and potentially 2027 will mean to Iran in 20 or 30 years' time. Stepping up to the highest level, I'd like to just put on the table that former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, who I understand is going to be one of the lead contenders for this year's Israeli elections. He made the point recently that in 20 years' time, Iran and Turkey will essentially change positions, opening up the conversation to include Erdogan's Turkey. It's a far cry from Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and what that amazing secular leader of the incredible nation of Turkey has done over the last 20 years. Very optimistic about what we're likely to see in Iran. Pessimistic, unfortunately, as to what we may see in Turkey going forward. Erdogan is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and it would seem as though this NATO nation that sits atop a country of 80 million people between Europe and Asia is doing in that nation.
So with the overthrow in Venezuela, there was a vacuum that was filled very quickly with a leadership that looks to be working in alliance to an extent with the United States. In Mexico, there seems to be a willingness to work with the United States as opposed to filling those kind of topples. However, in places like Iran, and as you alluded to with what Erdogan's direction may be, and the Muslim Brotherhood, there is a religious aspect as well there that is different to just carrot and stick response. So could you comment on what the Muslim Brotherhood actually is and how much the religious aspect of it all it plays a different role compared to other regime shifts?
Look, Muslim Brotherhood are a Sunni terrorist organization. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, are members of the broader Muslim Brotherhood. They date back to Salafist Wahhabists, proponents of a guy called Khatub, which came out of Egypt. Really unsavory characters, and I think the reality here is that we can't reason with unreasonable people. It's quite difficult to have any dealings with jihadists, Islamists. Now, that's not saying that the 1.9 billion adherents to the Muslim religion, one of three great Abrahamic religions. Not all Muslims are Islamists, but Muslim Brotherhood is not a benign form of Islam. Muslim Brotherhood is a politically driven theocracy that's trying to establish a global caliphate. They not only provide an unacceptable safety risk to the Jewish state, Muslim Brotherhood provide an unacceptable safety risk to the secular, the benign dictator in Egypt, President El-Sisi, but also the House of Saud, which is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The biggest targets on the agenda for Muslim Brotherhood. It's not Israel, it's actually Mecca and Medina, but they also pose an existential risk to Christians and Jews in Israel, based on the fact that the Temple Mount, the Al Quds Mosque, is the third holiest site in the Muslim faith.
So I'm talking more from the aspect of the how much a carrot and the stick response can work the same way that it has in seemingly adjacent conflicts.
As it relates to Iran, I think that the average Iranian is quite a secular and tolerant and progressive people, and so I'm far more optimistic as to the prognosis of Persia, modern day Iran, than I am to modern day Anatolia, Turkey. I see that at the end of the day, the people of Iran will author their tomorrow. And as President Trump has messaged very clearly, help was on its way. Help has arrived now where they're doing the heavy lifting. But at the end of the day, it'll be the people of Iran that need to exercise their agency. Things can only go one of three ways: better, worse, or stay the same. I think that in terms of nation states, there's a carrots and sticks approach, where it's in the world's best interests for a modern form of government comes about in Iran. That will take time, probably years, if not tens of years, but it's infinitely better than the descent into madness that the Ayatollahs have been providing, with what I think in time will be seen as malfeasance in terms of former US administration policy towards Iran, JCPOA, Biden and Obama level policies. But look, I don't make a political perspective. I've been apolitical across the whole of my first career. But I think that we've now got the benefit of what has actually played out with Iran, with the Ayatollahs, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the President Obama signature policy, which was supported by the gang of Western European nations. I think will be looked at in a more accurate but very critical sense as being a source of great instability
A Neville
and
Chamberlain-like moment.
profound loss of life. Yeah, I think that if that policy was in the field of medicine, there'd be a class action that the lawyers would litigate. It in my view, has been a causal factor in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives in the Middle East and even further afield.
And do actions like this have any bearing or effect to your military expertise on China's possibility of attacking Taiwan and the Chinese and the South China Sea, and Putin's willingness to go further in Ukraine?
Yeah, look, there's a great game playing out not only in the Middle East between the American eagle, the Russian bear, and the Chinese panda. Russia is decisively engaged in the Ukraine. Um, there's a vast loss of life, and they're pouring a lot of their treasure into that effort. The economy is contracting as sanctions bite, but Russia has been mobilized for war for a number of years. Um, China, what an amazing country of what gusting 1.5 billion people, but an odious leader and an odious ruling class in the Chinese Communist Party. Truly horrific governing structures that brutally suppress any dissent in the Middle Kingdom. Um, there's challenges that they're facing at the moment because their incursions into the US sphere, not only in Venezuela but into the Panama Canal, have undergone a reversion where they've lost their source of cheap energy from Venezuela and now cheap energy from Iran, and that is putting an odious regime into a much reduced position. There's chess pieces geostrategically that are being placed between the world's democracies led by the US under the current Trump administration and what previous regimes have talked about as an axis of evil. There are challenges that we're facing with some of the threat forces, and we've named them. Qatar is an odious regime, Turkey, Russia under Putin, China under Xi, formerly Venezuela under Maduro. There's North Korea under Kim. There's actually no moral equivalence between those dictatorships and what we may opine in the argy-bargy of US or Israeli politics between left and right.
So to those that protest and fear military action like what has just taken place, what do you have to say for why it is so integral and important to Western civilization that these actions do take place?
Yeah, look, I can sort of empathize and relate partially with platforms such as the Australian Greens that are rabid America haters and rabid anti-Semites. They think that they can just demand the Jewish state or America to apologize and compromise into a better tomorrow. I wish I was raising my kids in the universe that those odious, opportunistic individuals believe that we exist in. I think that there is a clash of civilizations that is playing out at the moment, as Samuel T. Huntington predicted, where we need to, I think, apply the guidance of the founder of modern liberalism, John Stuart Mill, who reminds us that while war is an ugly thing, it's not the ugliest of things. We would only need to contemplate with we don't need to contemplate what peace may look like as defined by Al Qaeda, Islamic State, Muslim Brotherhood, or the Ayatollahs to to suggest that we're living in a Dylan Thomas poem where we choose not to go gentle into that good night, we'll rage against the dying of the light. I think the simple binary that we face at the moment in this consequential age in which we're raising our kids is that we have values that are worth defending, where we've got a simple binary choice: stick up for our family, our values, and our way of life, or live with the consequences of our complacency and cravenness. And I think that the Greens leader of Germany um, is right when he mentioned around the 12-day war in June 2025 that Israel is doing the heavy lifting for the whole of the world. A nuclear-armed theocratic dictatorship in Persia actually presents an existential risk to our way of life in distant Australia, in New Zealand, in the US, Canada. It poses an existential safety risk to democratic traditions and rules globally.
How much can nations like Australia, maybe the United Kingdom, New Zealand, reactive economies that are just watching it all play out, do to protect themselves for whatever fallout may occur from different actions?
I think what we don't do is stick our head in the sand. There is a rules-based global order that's underpinned by the US. But what the nations of the world have done over decades has been shirking responsibilities, and the United States has been left to pay the bill. Now, the reality is that US debt payments at the moment exceed the money they allocated to defence. That's a really worrying trend. But what we've seen just recently in late June, early July, at a NATO conference that was attended by President Trump, Secretary of State Rubio, and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, is that all NATO nations, less Spain, have agreed to pay or contribute 5% of GDP towards defence. I think that getting involved and remembering what has underpinned our security as a democracy, free market economics, the rule of law, the emancipation of women and protection of minorities, Judeo-Christian values, where there is a choice. And I actually think that we're going to see this brought into more stark consequences in Australia and elsewhere. I say that with some trepidation, that my belief is that even after the murder of 15 people in Bondi on the 14th of December, I don't think the penny has yet dropped as to the age in which we're raising our kids. And part of the reason that I'm on this podcast, and I've founded a charity to combat anti-Semitism. I've written a couple of books, including A Light Still Burns, Israel and the Values Worth Defending, is that I've had unusual experiences and perspectives, and I put things in writing so people can read and choose upon which to orient themselves. In my judgment, things will worsen before they get better, including in Australia. And the only thing worse than being, facing worsening circumstances in Australia is being caught by surprise.
So if you had to sum it up with last words by answering the question of, first of all, to those who are living in the United States, Australia, or wherever, that are just watching these actions play out and maybe do have a bit of nerves, if you could give a bit of a message on why these actions are so important, and end off with what is your optimistic view on all of these actions ending up being.
Yeah, so look, we're competing today for a very tomorrow. That's the case in my reading, and I'm paraphrasing Arnold Toynbee. Civilizations don't appear to die of old age; they commit suicide. We've made some grievous mistakes over the last couple of decades. I think many of us have bought into the debunked thesis of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. We understand now that history has caught back up and we're competing today for our very tomorrow. We will win in the end. If we're not winning at a point in time, it's not the end, but only together will we prevail.